On the morning of September 14th, 1978, a New Hampshire State Park ranger named Warren Fitch climbed the fire road above Kinsman Notch to look at what a rock slide had exposed 2 nights before. He was 31 years old, 5 years into the job, and the incident slip he carried listed nothing more than a minor slope failure on the eastern face of Bald Peak, part of the Kinsman Ridge line above the town of Woodstock. Rain had come through the notch that week, heavy enough to loosen the thin soil that clings to granite slopes in that part of the White Mountains, and a hiker had reported hearing what she described as a long grinding sound somewhere above the trail sometime after midnight on the 12th. Nobody had gone up to check until Fitch's shift 2 days later. What he found at the top of the scree did not match the slip in his hand. A gap had opened in the granite, roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, framed by broken rock that had clearly fallen away from something rather than been pushed out from within. Fitch put his flashlight into the opening and saw a passage running back into the mountain, its walls unusually smooth for a fracture this fresh. He did not go further. He drove back down, radioed his district supervisor, and by nightfall, a wooden barricade sat across the base of the scree slope, manned for the first 2 nights by a seasonal employee who was told only that the site was unstable and off-limits. The written record of what came next survives only in pieces, and the pieces do not agree with each other. The state's own filing system says the passage was surveyed, assessed, and permanently sealed within 11 days. It does not say who gave the closure order, and it does not explain why a routine slope failure report was reclassified before the month was out. What survives instead is one detail repeated by nearly everyone who set foot on that mountain during that week. The passage was not the kind rock makes on its own. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Before the barricade went up, a 2-man survey crew spent 4 afternoons inside the passage, and their field notes, filed with the New Hampshire Division of Parks and Recreation and never published, describe a corridor that ran nearly straight for 62 feet before opening into a chamber roughly 20 feet across. The stone here is Conway granite, part of the White Mountain plutonic volcanic suite that crystallized deep underground more than 100 million years before anyone stood on top of it. Granite of this kind fractures along planes set by the pressure that formed it, and the resulting cavities, where they exist at all in New Hampshire, are jumbles of tumbled boulders, the kind found a few miles away at the well-known Lost River Caverns in the same notch, where visitors squeeze between house-sized blocks that fell and wedged against each other during the retreat of the last glacier. What the crew measured at Bald Peak did not look like that kind of collapse at all. The walls of the corridor held a flatness that granite does not produce by falling apart. 2 surveyors, working with a plumb line and a hand level because nothing more sophisticated had been carried up the mountain, recorded that the passage deviated from true vertical by less than half an inch over its full height. A tolerance, one of the 2 men noted, almost as an aside, was tighter than the tolerance on the footbridge his own crew had built the previous summer with modern equipment. The floor, swept clear of debris in patches near the chamber mouth, carried shallow parallel grooves, spaced with a regularity that one surveyor described in his notes as machine-like, though he crossed the word out and wrote nothing to replace it. The grooves ran the same direction as the corridor itself, disappearing under a later fall of rubble, roughly 40 feet in, rubble the crew never had time to clear before the closure order reached them. The chamber itself held little. A scatter of charcoal near the entrance, later dated to a period the state's own laboratory report called inconclusive because the sample was too small to process twice. A single worked stone, roughly the size of a fist, with 2 faces ground flat at an angle the crew's level put at almost exactly 90 degrees, the kind of precision that a hand tool can achieve only with a great deal of practiced patience, or with a jig the crew found no trace of. And along the back wall, a shallow basin cut into the rock, dry, holding nothing but a fine grey silt that nobody thought to test until years afterward, by which point the sample had been lost in a records transfer between 2 state offices that no longer exist under those names. The basin itself was measured twice, by two different men on two different afternoons, and both measurements agree to within a quarter of an inch, a level of agreement the surveyors themselves seemed to find more remarkable than either measurement alone. Word of the closure spread through Woodstock within days, the way news travels in a town of a few hundred year-round residents pressed against a state park boundary. A few long-time residents recalled, in interviews given to a local newspaper decades later for an anniversary retrospective that ran without much notice, that state trucks had come and gone from the fire road at odd hours that October, some after dark, at a pace that seemed unusual even for a routine backfill job. None of them had any way of knowing what was inside the mountain. What they remembered was the pace, and the fact that nobody from the state ever came down to the general store to answer questions, which struck more than one of them as out of character for a district that had always been, in the words of one resident quoted in that retrospective, generally happy to talk your ear off about anything happening on the ridge. What makes Bald Peak unusual is not the chamber. New England has other unexplained fissures, other pockets in granite and schist that local historians argue about at town meetings from Maine to Connecticut. What makes it unusual is what happened to the paperwork. A state geologist named Dr. Miriam Ashcroft, then 38 and 6 years into a research position with the University of New Hampshire, was brought in during the second week to assess the site before the closure order became final. Her preliminary letter to the division, dated September 22, 1978, recommended a full excavation season the following summer. It called the corridor's geometry, in her own words, difficult to reconcile with any natural process she was aware of in granite terrain, and it requested that the site remain barricaded but unsealed until a proper survey team could be assembled the following June. That letter is the last document in the file that engages with the site on its own terms. Everything filed after it treats the passage as a hazard to be closed, not a formation to be understood. The closure order itself, signed October the 2nd by a regional administrator named Thomas Vail, cites structural instability and public safety as the sole justification, 3 sentences long, unsupported by any engineering assessment on file. It authorizes the use of concrete and stone to permanently backfill the entrance, a job completed by a state crew over 3 days in late October, before the first hard frost made the work impossible until spring. One of the men on that crew, interviewed decades later for an unrelated local history project and never asked directly about Bald Peak, mentioned in passing that they had been told to work fast and not to talk about the job afterward, an instruction he assumed at the time was ordinary caution around a hazardous site and has never fully reconsidered since. No environmental review accompanies Vail's order, though the National Environmental Policy Act had required one for federal actions since 1970, and New Hampshire's own state-level review statute, passed only 2 years earlier, would ordinarily have applied to work of this kind on state parkland. The file contains no waiver, no exemption memo, nothing explaining why the requirement did not apply here. It simply is not addressed, in a state office that at the time was, by every other surviving record from the same years, meticulous about paperwork. A records request filed with the division in the late 1990s by an amateur local historian seeking any environmental or engineering assessment related to the closure returned a response stating that no such records could be located, a response that did not distinguish between records that were never created and records that once existed and had since gone missing. The daily activity log, kept at the Franconia Notch District Office for that October, has 3 consecutive days missing. The entries for September 30th through October 2nd are absent from the bound logbook, now held at the State Archives in Concord, the pages cut close to the spine rather than torn, a detail the state archivist confirmed on inspection but declined to interpret further. The entry for October 3rd resumes mid-sentence, in the same handwriting, discussing an unrelated maintenance matter involving a footbridge on a different trail entirely. Archive staff have offered the explanation that pages were occasionally removed for photocopying and not returned, and that explanation may well be correct. It does not appear in the congressional record summaries distributed to public libraries. The 3 missing days are the exact window in which, according to every other document in the file, the decision to permanently seal Bald Peak was made and signed. Dr. Ashcroft's own career took a turn that her colleagues at the time found difficult to explain. She had built her early reputation studying Pluton emplacement and fracture patterns in White Mountain granite, publishing 3 papers on the subject between 1974 and 1977, work that had earned her an invitation to present at a regional geology conference scheduled for the spring of 1979, an invitation she quietly declined without explanation 2 months after Bald Peak was sealed. After 1978, she published nothing further on New Hampshire granite geology. Her subsequent work, beginning in 1980 and continuing for the next decade, concerns sedimentary basins in the Connecticut River Valley, a shift a former department colleague later described, in a brief oral history recorded for the university archive, as sudden and never explained to the rest of the faculty. Ashcroft herself gave no public account of the change before her death in 2006. The single work stone recovered from the chamber does not appear in the state's mineral collection inventory. It appears once, in Ashcroft's own preliminary letter, described and measured to the millimeter. After that, it is not mentioned again in any surviving document, and no accession record exists showing it was ever formally catalogued, transferred or destroyed. One object from Bald Peak did survive, though not through any official channel. Warren Fitch kept a fragment of the corridor's grooved floorstone, broken loose during the backfill work and never logged, because a fellow crew member handed it to him before the crew truck left the site, telling him only that it seemed a shame for the whole thing to disappear without anyone keeping so much as a piece of it. Fitch, now in his late 70s and long retired from the Parks Division, has kept the fragment in his home in Lincoln, New Hampshire, for nearly 5 decades, wrapped in a cloth in a desk drawer. He has shown it to exactly 2 researchers who asked, and declined every other request, on the grounds that the state never asked for it back, and he sees no reason to hand a piece of unresolved history to an agency that sealed the rest of it without explanation. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Bald Peak is not the only granite ridge in New England where a state agency closed a passage before its examination was finished. In 1953, a Vermont forester named Alden Cobb was cutting a fire access road above Underhill on the western flank of Mount Mansfield when his crew broke through into a fissure in the local schist roughly 40 feet long. Cobb's field notes, filed with the Vermont Forests, Parks and Recreation Department, and rediscovered decades later in an uncatalogued box during an office move, describe a chamber with a floor swept unusually clean and a set of shallow grooves along one wall that Cobb, with no training in geology and no reason to invent the comparison, called machine marks in his own handwriting, twice, in 2 separate entries written 4 days apart. The Vermont agency closed the fissure with a rockfall barrier 8 days after Cobb's report, citing collapse risk in a memo nearly identical in length and phrasing to the one Thomas Vail would sign in New Hampshire a quarter century later, and no excavation or academic study followed. The chamber remains sealed today, its location marked on internal agency maps but omitted from every public trail guide issued since. In 1961, a Massachusetts field surveyor named Dorothy Kelleher, working a boundary survey for what was then the State Department of Natural Resources near Savoy Mountain in the Berkshires, recorded a fissure in Neuse bedrock, with walls she described as too regular to be a natural break, and a floor she measured, using her own transit, as level to within an inch across a span of 18 feet. Her supervisor's response, preserved in a 2-line memo, ordered the site marked as unsafe and excluded from the published survey map, without a site visit from anyone above Kelleher's own rank, and without any independent measurement of the passage she had described. No sample was retained. No further study is recorded. Kelleher's original field book, unlike most surveying records from that office, cannot be located today, and the office's own accession ledger shows no record of it ever having been transferred, destroyed, or lost through any of the ordinary channels that would normally leave a paper trail of their own. Across all three sites, the same pattern holds, even though the bedrock differs from granite to schist to gneiss, and the decades span nearly a full generation. A discovery made by a low-ranking field worker, not a scientist, and not an administrator. A closure ordered within days or weeks, on safety grounds that were never independently verified by a second party outside the agency's own chain of command. No academic excavation permitted before the site was sealed, in any of the three cases. And in each instance, at least one physical trace of the discovery separated from the official record entirely, whether by a records transfer that lost a sample, a field book that went missing without documentation, or a fragment carried home in a coat pocket by someone who was never asked to give it back. None of the three agencies involved coordinated with the others. Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire operated under entirely separate state bureaucracies, in different decades, with no record of communication between them about any of these sites, no shared committee, no joint report. The pattern is not the product of a single decision passed down a chain of command. It is the product of the same reflex exercised 3 times in 3 states across a span of 25 years by people who almost certainly never knew of each other's existence. A fourth possible case, a brief 1946 memo referencing an unnamed fissure closed near Bethel, Maine, surfaces only once in a state forestry newsletter and lacks enough surviving detail to include with confidence, though it is consistent in outline with the other 3. What the Bald Peak Corridor requires, if its geometry is taken at face value, is difficult to state plainly without overreaching what the evidence actually supports. A vertical deviation of less than half an inch over 62 feet, cut into granite with tools no field crew ever recovered, does not match anything in the documented record of pre-contact activity in the White Mountains, and it does not match the natural fracture behavior of Conway granite either. A rock-type geologists have studied closely for more than a century, precisely because it is so common across the region. The survey crew's own notes stop short of an explanation. Ashcroft's letter stops short of one. The record does not resolve what made the passage, and honesty requires saying so plainly rather than filling the gap with a name that the evidence cannot support. What the physical evidence does establish is narrower, and it stands on firmer ground. A corridor existed, cut or worn with a precision the crew that measured it could not account for using anything they understood about granite or about the tools available to whoever might have shaped it. A geologist flagged it as worth a full excavation season and was overruled within 3 weeks by a decision whose paper trail has a hole in it exactly where the decision itself should be recorded. A worked stone that should sit today in a state collection does not sit there, and no document explains where it went. And a fragment of the floor that should have gone into that same collection instead sits in a drawer in a house in Lincoln, New Hampshire, in the keeping of the one man who was there on the morning it was found, and has never stopped wondering what the rest of the corridor would have shown, had anyone been allowed to keep looking before the concrete went in. Bald Peak is closed today, its entrance a slope of concrete and loose stone indistinguishable, to anyone hiking past it, from the granite around it. The current White Mountain National Forest and New Hampshire State Park trail maps mark the fire road as discontinued, with no note explaining why, and hikers who wander off the marked trail today find only a low concrete apron, half buried under decades of leaf litter and fallen granite scree, easy to walk past without a second glance. Warren Fitch still drives up to the old fire road once or twice a year, parks where he parked in 1978, and looks at the spot from a distance, because the state that sealed it never told him, or anyone else, what they found inside before they closed the door for good. He keeps the fragment in its cloth in the desk drawer, and he has said, to the 2 researchers who were allowed to see it, that he intends to keep it there until someone from the state finally asks the right question, the one nobody asked him in 1978, and nobody has asked since. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.